Everybody, so on Sunday we heard one of my personal favorite parables from Christ, the story of Lazarus and the rich man. Now obviously, as the title I gave states, there are two characters in this parable: a poor man whom Christ calls Lazarus, and a rich man, a person that Christ doesn't even give a name. So the story's set up basically so that you have a rich man who's living in his mansion, and he's got all the food that he could enjoy and eats sumptuously every single day. And then you have at his gate, laid there, it says in our translation, the word in Greek you could even translate as thrown there, dumped there, is this Lazarus, a poor man, a man who's covered with sores. And the word that's used for the sores, it's like festering, really, oozing, gross sores. I'm sure we've all had experiences seeing people who've had something, some sore on their body that you've felt like, oh, it's just disgusting just to look at. He's covered with these. So you have this poor man, Lazarus, and he's there, and he doesn't even receive from the rich man, no matter how much he desires it, the crumbs that fall from his table. In those times, the crumbs that fell from the table, it wasn't like they dropped by accident off the table. Basically, what people did is they dipped their bread into the food that they were eating, if it was honey or whatever. And then after they were done eating, they'd use the scraps of bread to wipe their hands off, and they'd toss it under the table as food for the dogs. So this poor man, Lazarus, wasn't even receiving what was basically waste, the replacement of napkins at that time, from the rich man. So he had nothing. He was in abject poverty and silent at the gate of this rich man. The rich man probably saw him every day. He probably, either rode by him or walked by him. He may not have noticed him. He may not have even said a word to him his entire life, but he was there. He passed him. Now, one of the other things to point out, I guess, is this rich man was clothed in purple. Purple's an important color, and we hear it in other places in the Gospels because it's the color of royalty. Why royalty? Because of the dye that was used to dye things purple was very costly. It took a lot of these shells that purple came from. It took a lot of these shells to crush to make even a little bit. So he was very, very high class. And Christ is addressing this parable to many of the Pharisees who may not have been as rich as this rich man supposedly was, but who at least could understand the amount of wealth that he has through these different symbols that Christ is pointing out. Now, the poor man, Lazarus, is at the gate. He's silent. He's ignored by the rich man, but he isn't ignored by the dogs. The dogs come and lap at his sores, and I think sometimes we want to think, well, look, even the dogs showed mercy on this poor man, but it's possible and perhaps even probable that the dogs weren't licking at the sores as though they were the pets of Lazarus, but they were probably gnawing at the sores. These are wild, ugly dogs who lived on the streets. These weren't dogs that would be a pet. And so they increased the torment of this poor man dumped at the gate of the rich man. Well, Christ goes ahead and lays this out. The Pharisees probably thought, this poor man, this Lazarus, he seems like he's basically cursed by God. He's living a life in desperate poverty, probably because of his own sins. Probably he was the cause of it. And the rich man seems like an upstanding person. He was probably well loved in his society and by his servants and all of the people that surrounded him, perhaps even by the religious leaders, what have you. So they both die, Christ says. When he says that Lazarus dies, he says the angels come and they carry him to heaven. And he says when the rich man dies, he's buried. So the soul of the poor Lazarus is taken and he's placed into the lap or the bosom of Abraham. Abraham being one of the great patriarchs of the faith. The rich man, however, finds himself in a place that's very uncomfortable and burning, is how it's described. But he can see from afar off Lazarus and where Lazarus is sitting in the bosom of Abraham. And he recognizes them both. And so he cries out, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus to dip his finger in water and to just place a drop on my tongue to help relinquish some of this burning that I'm feeling." Well, Abraham responds, "That's impossible. Because you received your comfort and your good things in your former life. And Lazarus, he got nothing. He was in distress. He was in suffering and pain. And so now the roles are reversed. And Lazarus has found his time for comfort. And you have found your time for suffering. Besides that, there's a great chasm that Abraham describes between where he sits and where the rich man is sitting. You can't cross from one to the other, back and forth. You just are on your side of the chasm. So, the rich man, who I think by now we can suppose is in Sheol and Hades, right? He's experiencing a foretaste of, the terrors of hell. And we can assume that this bosom of Abraham is an icon of paradise. Again, a foretaste of heaven. The rich man replies to Abraham, and he says, well, if that's the case, go to my father's house. Send Lazarus to my father's house. I have 5 brothers there. They live the same way as I do. Tell them so that they can repent and so that they won't be in the torment that I'm in. Well, Abraham again replying, and remember, through this whole gospel, the poor Lazarus doesn't say a word. He's silent the whole time, alive and in Abraham's bosom. And so you have the rich man now begging for the sake of his family, hoping that at least they can be saved. But Abraham kind of blows him off and says, they have the law, they have the prophets, they have Moses. They've been given all the things that God has deemed that they need to be able to do what they need to do. But the rich man, he says, no. You don't understand. They're not going to get it. I didn't get it. I had that too. Send Lazarus back from the dead. If you send Lazarus back from the dead, they'll believe. They'll convert. They'll repent. But Abraham, recognizing in wisdom that this just isn't the case, tells the rich man, if they don't believe Moses and the prophets, if they don't believe all the things that God has given them to this point, even if one should rise from the dead, they still won't believe. By putting these words into Abraham's mouth, Christ is condemning these Pharisees. And I think that one of the reasons that I really enjoy this parable, for as frightening as it is, and remember, this is sort of the equivalent of the parable of the sheep and the goats, but at this half of the year. We're about as far away liturgically as we can get from that parable of the Last Judgment from Matthew. Here in Luke, this is another ominous one. And so we hear that it's too late. It's too late for the rich man who's dead, and for his brothers, who are icons of these Pharisees, these scribes. Even they won't repent when they see a dead man rise from the dead. And again, to point this out, why it's my favorite is because this poor man, Lazarus, the man who has a name, he's the good guy in this story, right? He's the one that the rich man says to send back. Well, in the Gospel of St. John, theologian, we find that there is a Lazarus who dies. A righteous Lazarus. And even a silent Lazarus. A Lazarus who was poor in spirit. A Lazarus who was a friend of the God-man, of Christ. And this Lazarus was raised from the dead. The name Lazarus comes from Eleazar, and it means one who is helped by God. And just as in this parable, Lazarus is comforted by God after all of the torturous suffering he experienced in his long life, that Lazarus too, the brother of Mary and Martha, will be helped out of the grave by Jesus Christ. But Abraham's words ring true still beyond this. Because even though Lazarus is raised from the dead, the Pharisees, they don't turn, they don't repent, they don't change their ways, they don't change their mind about God or about his righteousness. Because we see in St. John's Gospel, after the resurrection of Lazarus by Christ, once he's breathing again after 4 days in the tomb, the Pharisees say, oh, we're still going to kill Christ, and we're going to kill Lazarus too. Lazarus doesn't become a point of mercy for them. God gives them Lazarus to tell them to repent. It's a gift. But they look at Lazarus and they see him as a condemnation of perhaps their own falsehood, of their inability to make such great wonders shine forth. Christ was able to. And Lazarus is living proof. And they're ready to kill him and Christ. So this parable is a story of, again, a lot of things sort of switching places. You have this rich man who's brought up in sort of the paradise of his own home. You know, he even has gates to his home. And the poor man who has nothing, not even a crumb. But God switches things around, and now it's Lazarus, who has everything he could imagine, the paradise of Abraham's bosom. And it's the rich man who doesn't even have a drop of water. He's nothing. You have this rich man who is probably well known in his community, made a name for himself maybe. And this poor Lazarus, the poor man with the sores, the festering wounds that the dogs even gnawed at. But again, God switches things around. Now it's Lazarus' name that will be remembered by God, right? We sing Vechnaya Pamyat, memory eternal. God will remember Lazarus, but the rich man doesn't even have a name. Not just because this is a parable, but because it shows that in hell, that relationship with God is so corrupted, so rejected by those dwelling there, that God doesn't need to give those souls a name. It's a terrible and scary thought, but it's something that we have to look at very deeply, because as much as we look at Lazarus as the sort of hero in this story, it's the rich man that Christ wants us to see ourselves as, because we're the ones that have to change. We're the ones that have to repent. A lot of people hear this story and they say, well, if the rich man had just given something, given money perhaps to the poor man, everything would have been better. But being rich or being poor, that in and of itself is not evil or virtuous. Virtues clothe people who are rich and poor. We have saints in our church who were amazingly rich in this world. And of course we have saints who had nothing. Not to say, by the way, that even all the poor are going to be saved. St. John Chrysostom, who probably spoke as much as any saint in our church about how much we need to care for the poor, readily admitted that, hey, a lot of the poor, even given their situation, they're basically envious of the people that have things. They're envious of the rich. They hate the rich. They despise them, even if they're given what they need to get on with life. That's not a condemnation on everyone, but it shows us again that whether you think you have a lot of money, whether you think that your family is well off, or whether you think that maybe you don't have much at all. Maybe you compare yourself to, those people you see on the side of the road, and maybe you are one of them. Or maybe you compare yourself to the 1%, or maybe you're one of them too. But regardless, the problem wasn't so much money. It wasn't that the rich man, never gave to charity. Maybe he did. But when it came to this particular relationship with Lazarus, he could have recognized and seen Christ in this man. He could have recognized and seen the face of God, the image and likeness of God in this poor and wretched man who was thrown or dumped at his gate day after day. And so we need to look around and say, do we see those people, whether they're richer or poorer than us, that maybe typically you'd expect to ignore or even despise based on how they're dressed, what they look like, how they act, what they do? Do we sever our relationship with them, or do we love them? What Christ was condemning the Pharisees of was that they didn't love men like Lazarus. The simple, the quiet, the abject, those in suffering. They just abandoned them. Abandoned them from their whole minds. They weren't even a thought. This gospel is showing us, through Christ's words, through this parable, we need to love those who are rich and those who are poor. We need to love those who differ from us. We need to love those who live a lifestyle entirely different from ours, even a lifestyle that we might be tempted to call condemned, a lifestyle we might be tempted to call wretched. We have to love them, because if we don't, then we bring the same condemnation on ourselves that's foreshadowed in this parable. We'll be the ones who encounter that burning. We'll be the ones who desire just a drop of water, but don't get anything. Because this is the life we're given to make the choices we make. After that's too late. The brother even interceded for his 5 other brothers before Abraham, who one would think would be able to pray to God for him. But even there, in the state of death, there was nothing anyone could do. So let's keep this gospel in mind going forward as we approach the Nativity Fast. It gives us a lot to think about when it comes to, of course, prayer and almsgiving, caring for others. Remember, almsgiving is not just money. It's about truly loving and caring for everybody around us, anonymously and in the open. Let's be an icon to others of Christ and of how Christ loved everyone around him with a very powerful and authoritative love. And beyond that, when it comes to money, don't despise the poor. Don't despise the rich. Because the rich are given money so that the poor might be blessed. And the poor exist so that the rich might be blessed. God has granted us as gifts to one another. Let's treat each other that way. Thanks, guys. It's been a good year so far. Keep doing your readings. We have St. Nicholas Day coming up soon, so remember that. Mark it on your calendars, December 6th. And Vespers is obviously the night before on December 5th. I look forward to seeing you all y'all again next week, and take care until then. For me and Chelsea, bye for now.